It was a quiet Friday night in the small town of Springdale. The streets were almost empty, lit only by streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. Major Aaron Williams, a U.S. Army officer, was driving home after a long day spent visiting his parents. He was tired but calm, listening to soft music on the radio. Aaron had spent years serving his country overseas, and now he cherished moments like these, peaceful, ordinary nights. As he turned onto a narrow road, he noticed the flashing red and blue lights of a police car behind him. Aaron glanced at his rearview mirror, puzzled. His car was in perfect condition, and he hadn't broken any traffic laws. Still, he decided to pull over just in case the officers needed to pass by. To his surprise, the police car stopped right behind him. Aaron rolled down his window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, as he had always been taught. A tall officer stepped out of the police car, followed by two others. They walked towards him slowly, their flashlights pointed directly at his car. Aaron's heart sank a little. Something about their approach didn't feel right, but he remained calm. "Good evening, officers," Aaron said politely as the first officer approached his window. "Is there a problem?" The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he shined his flashlight directly into Aaron's face, making it difficult for him to see. After a few seconds, the officer said, "License and registration." Aaron nodded and reached for his wallet and the car's glove compartment. "I'll grab them now," he said, making sure his movements were slow and deliberate. He handed over his driver's license, registration, and even his military ID, hoping it would make the interaction smoother. The officer looked at the documents, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked abruptly. "I'm driving home," Aaron replied calmly. "I live just a few miles from here." The officer frowned but didn't respond. Meanwhile, the other two officers stood by the car, their eyes scanning Aaron closely. One of them whispered something to the first officer, who nodded and turned back to Aaron. "This car doesn't look like it belongs here," the officer said. "Are you sure you're not lost?" Aaron felt a knot in his stomach, but kept his voice steady. "No, sir. I'm very familiar with this area. Is there a specific reason you pulled me over?" The officer hesitated before replying, as if searching for an answer. "We're just checking things out. Stay here." As the officers stepped away to talk amongst themselves, Aaron sat quietly in his car. He couldn't help but feel that something was off. Why was he being stopped without a clear reason? Despite his unease, he stayed calm, knowing that his actions in this moment could shape what happened next. Aaron sat patiently in his car, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The faint sound of the radio played in the background, but his focus was entirely on the three officers standing a few feet away, speaking in hushed voices. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language seemed tense. Every second felt longer than the last. After a moment, one of the officers approached the car again. This time, his tone was more direct. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Aaron's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "May I ask why, officer?" he asked politely. "We need to check something." "Step out of the car," the officer repeated, his voice firm. Though unsure why this was necessary, Aaron complied. He unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out of the vehicle. The cool night air brushed against his face as he stood next to his car, towering slightly over the officer who had spoken to him. Despite his calm exterior, Aaron could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood of your car," the officer instructed. Aaron hesitated for a split second, but then he complied, moving slowly to avoid alarming anyone. "Can I ask what this is about?" he asked again, his voice steady. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he patted down Aaron's pockets, checking for something. Aaron wasn't sure what they were looking for, but he decided to remain calm. He'd learned long ago in the military that staying composed could often de-escalate tense situations. As the officer continued his search, one of the other officers leaned closer to Aaron's car, shining a flashlight into the back seat. "What's all this?" the second officer called out. Aaron glanced over his shoulder, confused. "That's just some personal belongings," he replied. "Books, a gym bag, nothing unusual." The officers exchanged glances, as if they didn't believe him. One of them opened the back door of the car without asking, rifling through the items. Aaron's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his thoughts to himself. He wanted to avoid making the situation worse. "Everything okay?" Aaron asked, trying to sound cooperative. The first officer stepped back, crossing his arms. "What were you doing driving here this late at night? Do you live in this neighborhood?" Aaron nodded. "Yes, sir. I was visiting family earlier and heading home." "Is there something wrong?" The officer stared at him for a moment before responding. "You're not acting suspicious, but something about this situation doesn't feel right." Aaron tilted his head slightly, his patience starting to wear thin. "I've complied with everything you've asked. If I'd done nothing wrong, am I free to go?" The question seemed to catch the officers off guard. They exchanged another look, clearly unsure how to proceed. Aaron stayed silent, waiting for their next move, even as a feeling of unease settled deeper in his chest. For a brief moment, there was silence. Aaron stood by his car, his hands still resting on the hood, his mind racing. He was trying to remain calm, but the way the officers were acting didn't feel right. He had done nothing wrong. He was just an army major, heading home after a family visit. Yet the officers didn't seem to care about his explanations. After a long pause, the first officer spoke again, his voice colder than before. "We're going to have to search your car. Step away from it." Aaron didn't want to escalate things any further, so he stepped back slowly. "You have to have a reason to search my car," he said, trying to stay calm. "I haven't done anything wrong." But the officers were not listening to him. One of them, the one who had been rifling through his things earlier, now moved toward Aaron, a strange intensity in his eyes. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the officer warned. Aaron felt his heart race. His military training told him to stay calm, to avoid confrontation, but something about this situation felt dangerous. The second officer, the one who had stayed silent, now raised his hand and pointed a flashlight straight at Aaron's chest. "Just do what we say," the officer ordered sharply. Aaron was taken aback. "What? What do you mean, do what you say?" "I'm just trying to understand why I'm being treated this way." Without warning, the officer who had been speaking pulled out a gun and pointed it directly at Aaron. The cold metal of the gun gleamed in the light. Aaron's heart skipped a beat. His instincts screamed at him to stay calm, but inside, he was fighting a mix of fear and anger. "Get on the ground," the officer shouted. For a moment, Aaron froze. He couldn't believe what was happening. His hand slowly moved up, not in resistance, but to show he wasn't armed. "I'm not resisting," Aaron said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear building inside him. "I don't have any weapons. I'm just trying to understand why you're doing this." The officer's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer. "You don't get to question me," he snapped, still holding the gun. "Just do as you're told." Aaron's mind raced. He couldn't understand why things had escalated so quickly. He had done everything right. He had tried to cooperate, tried to explain himself. Yet, the officer still pointed his gun at him. His thoughts turned to his family, his colleagues, and his fellow soldiers. He couldn't let this moment become something worse. In that instant, Aaron made a choice. He knew he had to stay calm, no matter what. He wasn't about to let fear dictate his actions. "I'm a U.S. Army officer," Aaron said slowly, his voice unwavering. "You're making a mistake." The officer hesitated, the gun still trained on him. But the seconds dragged on, and Aaron couldn't tell if his calmness was working or if things were about to take a dangerous turn. The seconds felt like hours. Aaron stood there, hands raised in the air, staring at the officer who still had a gun pointed at him. His mind raced, but he forced himself to focus on staying calm. He couldn't let the situation escalate further. He needed to think carefully, speak clearly, and most importantly, avoid making any sudden movements. "I'm an army officer," Aaron repeated slowly, his voice steady. "I've served my country. I've followed the law, and I know my rights. I'm not a threat to you." The officer's expression softened just slightly, but he didn't lower the gun. Instead, the officer glanced over at his colleagues, who were standing off to the side, watching the scene unfold. The second officer, the one who had been quiet for most of the interaction, stepped forward. "Let's calm down," the second officer said, his voice gentler than the first. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot." Aaron didn't relax just yet. The tension in the air was still thick, and he could see that the first officer was uncertain, his grip tightening slightly on the gun. But the second officer's words seemed to have an effect. "I'm not resisting," Aaron continued, his tone respectful. "I'm just trying to understand why I'm being treated this way. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not armed, and I'm not a danger to anyone." The first officer looked back at Aaron for a long moment. Aaron could see the doubt in his eyes. He had been trained to read people, to understand their reactions, and right now, this officer was unsure. That uncertainty was a good sign. It meant that maybe, just maybe, the situation wasn't as out of control as it felt. "I've been driving home from visiting my family," Aaron went on, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm just a man trying to get home. I don't deserve to be treated like this." The first officer shifted his weight, lowering his gun just a fraction. The second officer glanced over at his partner, then back at Aaron, and nodded. "We understand. We don't want any trouble. But you need to understand, this is standard procedure. We have to check everyone." Aaron nodded slowly, not fully understanding, but trying to keep the conversation going. "I get that, officer. But why stop me? Why not someone else? This isn't just about a routine check. You're making assumptions about me based on what? My appearance? My car?" The second officer took a deep breath, and for the first time, Aaron saw a flicker of empathy in his eyes. "We didn't mean to make you feel like that, but we're just doing our jobs." "I understand," Aaron replied, trying to stay diplomatic. "But I'm not the enemy. I've fought for my country. I've fought for justice. I'm not here to cause any harm." There was another long silence. The tension was still there, but the gun was no longer aimed directly at him. Aaron's calmness seemed to be having an effect on the officers. He couldn't let his guard down yet, but he felt a small shift in the air, a hint of respect, a possibility for resolution. Then the first officer spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "All right, Major. We'll let you go. Just stay out of trouble." Aaron nodded, finally lowering his hands from the hood of the car. He could feel his heart racing, but he stayed composed. "Thank you, officer." As the officers backed away, Aaron let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The worst of it seemed to be over, but he knew that this was far from the end. Something wasn't right, and he would need to make sure his voice was heard. The moment Aaron was allowed to walk away from the scene, his mind was in turmoil. His body felt tense from the fear and uncertainty that had flooded through him just moments before. The officers who had been so aggressive were now fading into the background. But the thoughts in Aaron's head wouldn't let go. Why had things escalated to that point? What had he done to make them treat him this way? As Aaron got into his car and drove away, he tried to shake off the feeling of unease. The road ahead was quiet, but his mind kept replaying the incident. The flash of the officer's gun, the tense silence, the way they had treated him. He had remained calm, had spoken reasonably, and in the end, they let him go. But the whole thing didn't sit right. It wasn't until he got home that Aaron truly began to understand the weight of what had happened. He sat in his driveway for a while, the engine of his car still running, thinking about everything. He knew he couldn't just forget it. He couldn't let it slide as just another bad experience. Something had to be done. The next morning, Aaron made the decision to file a formal complaint with the police department. He wasn't sure what good it would do, but he knew he had to stand up for himself and for anyone else who might face the same treatment. His military training had taught him how to face challenges head-on, and this was no different. He had to ensure that what happened to him didn't happen to someone else. As soon as the complaint was filed, word of the incident started to spread. Passers-by who had seen the situation unfold had recorded it on their phones, and now the video was making its rounds on social media. What had started as a routine traffic stop quickly turned into a public discussion about the treatment of civilians, particularly people of color, by law enforcement. The video was shocking to many viewers. It showed Aaron standing there, calmly explaining his situation, while the officers treated him with suspicion and hostility. The moment the gun was drawn, the tension was palpable. It made people question how such a thing could happen in a routine traffic stop. Was it just an isolated incident, or was there something larger at play? By the next day, news outlets had picked up the story. Interviews were conducted with Aaron, who explained his side of the story with the same calm and clear-headed approach he had taken with the officers. His words resonated with many. He was just a man going about his life, but he had been treated unfairly simply because of assumptions the officers had made. Support flooded in from people across the country, especially from civil rights groups. They called for accountability, for answers. They wanted to know why Aaron, a decorated military officer, had been treated as if he were a criminal. They demanded that the police department investigate the officers involved. Aaron had no idea where this would lead, but he knew one thing. He had made the right decision in speaking up. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could ensure that others wouldn't face the same kind of treatment. The next chapter of this story was just beginning, and Aaron was ready to see it through, no matter how difficult it might be. The morning after Aaron filed his complaint, the story of what had happened to him began to spread like wildfire. News stations picked it up, and soon people across the country were talking about the incident. What started as a routine traffic stop quickly became the center of a larger discussion about fairness, race, and the treatment of civilians by law enforcement. On social media, many people were shocked by what they had seen in the video. It showed Aaron, an Army officer, calmly trying to explain his situation, but instead of being treated with respect, he was faced with suspicion and hostility. The moment the officer drew his gun, the tension was undeniable. Viewers were left wondering how something like this could happen to someone who had served his country. Support for Aaron came pouring in from all corners of the country. Military personnel, civilians, and even people who had never met him rallied behind him. Many expressed their admiration for the way Aaron had handled the situation, staying calm and collected even when things seemed to be escalating. The U.S. Army, where Aaron had served for many years, quickly issued a statement of support. In their message, they condemned the actions of the police officers involved and emphasized that they stood by Aaron, who had always shown dedication, integrity, and respect for the law. The Army highlighted that no one should be treated unfairly based on assumptions or biases. Aaron's story also caught the attention of civil rights groups, who saw this incident as another example of the challenges faced by people of color when dealing with law enforcement. They called for greater accountability and changes within police departments to ensure that such incidents did not happen again. The fact that Aaron was a decorated Army officer made the incident even more troubling to them. If someone like him could be treated this way, how many others were facing similar situations? The public outcry became louder as more details about the officer's behavior emerged. People wanted answers. They wanted to know why the officers had treated Aaron the way they had. Why had they assumed he was a threat simply because he was driving in the area? Why had they acted with such aggression when he had done nothing wrong? The police department, under increasing pressure, announced that they would conduct an internal investigation. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave while the department looked into the incident. The police chief assured the public that the department would thoroughly review the situation and take appropriate action. Aaron, meanwhile, continued to speak out. He gave interviews with news outlets, sharing his experience and urging people to stand up for fairness and justice. Despite the tension and uncertainty, Aaron felt a sense of purpose. He knew he had to use his voice to make a difference. He couldn't change the past, but he could work toward a future where people wouldn't have to go through what he had experienced. As the investigation into the incident continued, Aaron's story remained at the forefront of public discussion. It was clear that this was a moment that could spark real change, and Aaron was ready to be part of that change. The days following the incident were filled with tension. Aaron knew that the situation had far-reaching consequences, not just for him, but for the entire community. The police department had promised an investigation into the actions of the officers, and the pressure from the public was mounting. People wanted justice, and Aaron wanted answers. It wasn't long before the police chief publicly announced that the 3 officers involved in the traffic stop had been placed on administrative leave. This meant they would be temporarily removed from active duty while the investigation was conducted. The chief assured the public that the department was taking the matter seriously and would conduct a thorough review of the situation. As the investigation unfolded, more details began to surface. The officers' actions were under intense scrutiny, and many were asking how such an incident could have happened in the first place. The video of the traffic stop, which had already gone viral, was being analyzed by experts and law enforcement professionals. Some people raised questions about the officers' behavior, while others pointed to the systemic issues within the police department as a whole. The public's response continued to grow louder. Civil rights organizations were demanding more than just an investigation. They wanted to see real accountability. They called for the officers to be fired, arguing that their actions were not just a result of poor judgment, but of deep-rooted bias. The video had shown the officers treating Aaron unfairly based on assumptions that had nothing to do with his behavior. Aaron watched as the investigation played out. He knew that the public was closely watching the police department's every move. He had seen how quickly the news cycle could move on to the next story. But this time, it felt different. This time, people were determined to see change. The investigation itself took several weeks. The police department interviewed the officers involved, as well as other witnesses who had been present during the traffic stop. They also reviewed the body camera footage and other evidence that had been collected. During this time, the officers involved in the incident remained on leave, and many people speculated about what would happen next. Finally, the police chief made an official statement. The department had completed its investigation, and the results were clear. The officers' actions were found to be in violation of department policies and procedures. Their behavior had been inappropriate, and they had failed to act in a way that upheld the standards of law enforcement. As a result, all 3 officers were terminated from their positions. It was a dramatic move that sent a clear message to the public. The department was not going to tolerate misconduct, especially when it came to treating civilians unfairly. For Aaron, it was a bittersweet victory. While he was glad to see the officers held accountable, he knew that this was just one small step toward addressing larger issues within law enforcement. He had experienced firsthand how things could go wrong, but now he had the chance to make sure it didn't happen again. The firing of the officers made headlines across the country. Some people praised the decision, saying it was a necessary step toward building trust between law enforcement and the community. Others, however, believed it was just a symbolic gesture, and they called for more sweeping changes. Aaron remained focused on his mission: to continue speaking out, to continue pushing for accountability, and to ensure that no one else would have to face the same treatment he had endured. After the officers were fired, the conversation around Aaron's case began to shift. The police department had taken swift action, and the public was divided. Some applauded the decision, saying that it was a much-needed step toward accountability, while others felt it didn't go far enough. But one thing was clear: Aaron's story had sparked a larger conversation about how people, especially people of color, were treated by law enforcement. Aaron, on the other hand, felt a sense of relief, but knew that the fight wasn't over. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, had helped expose some serious flaws in the system. But he understood that real change didn't come from a single incident. It came from continued effort, from every person who spoke up and took action. In the weeks following the officer's dismissal, Aaron became a more visible voice in the discussion about police reform. He began speaking at community events, sharing his experience and encouraging others to stand up when they were treated unfairly. His story, which had started with a simple traffic stop, had now grown into a call for change. Despite the attention he received, Aaron remained humble. He didn't want the focus to be on him as an individual but on the larger issue. "This isn't about me," he said during one of his interviews. "This is about making sure that no one else has to go through what I did. It's about making sure that all of us are treated with respect, regardless of who we are or where we come from." The police department, under pressure from both the public and the city's leadership, began implementing changes. They introduced mandatory bias training for all officers and established a community oversight committee to review police actions more closely. The department also promised to improve its transparency, making internal investigations more open to the public. It was a start, but Aaron knew that much more work was needed. In the months that followed, Aaron continued to advocate for reform, speaking at rallies, writing op-eds, and engaging with people in his community. His message was clear. Accountability wasn't just about firing officers. It was about changing the culture of law enforcement to ensure that every person, no matter their background, was treated with dignity. Though Aaron's story had brought attention to the issue, he was just one person. But through his actions, he had encouraged others to join the fight. Civil rights groups, community leaders, and everyday citizens rallied behind him, pushing for stronger policies, better training, and more rigorous oversight of law enforcement agencies. The attention Aaron had received didn't go unnoticed by the police department. They realized that the steps they had taken were just the beginning, and they continued to make changes. In many ways, Aaron's experience had opened their eyes to the need for reform. And while the road ahead was long, there was hope that things could improve. For Aaron, the battle wasn't over, but he felt a sense of accomplishment. The officers who had wronged him were held accountable, and the conversation about police reform was stronger than ever. He knew that his work was just beginning, but he also knew that with the support of his community, change was possible. As time passed, Aaron's life slowly began to return to a sense of normalcy. The firestorm that had surrounded his case began to calm, but the lessons learned from the ordeal stayed with him. Though the officers who had treated him unfairly had been fired, Aaron knew that true change required more than just disciplinary action. It required a shift in how people saw each other and how systems operated. In the months following the incident, Aaron continued to speak out. He attended town hall meetings, worked with community leaders, and advocated for stronger oversight of law enforcement. His voice had become a symbol of hope for those who had faced unfair treatment, and his determination inspired many others to join him in the fight for justice. Despite the progress, Aaron knew that the work was far from over. As much as he had hoped that the firing of the 3 officers would lead to lasting change, he understood that it was only the beginning. The issues that led to his mistreatment ran deep. They were not just about a few bad officers. They were about a system that needed to evolve. Aaron decided to take his advocacy even further. He worked with local lawmakers to help shape new policies aimed at reducing racial profiling and increasing police accountability. He pushed for more transparent systems within police departments, where officers were regularly trained on recognizing their biases and treating everyone with fairness and dignity. While the work was difficult, Aaron saw progress. Many police departments across the country began to adopt the reforms he had fought for. Community-based policing, where officers engage more closely with the neighborhoods they serve, became a key focus in many areas. The idea was to build trust between the community and law enforcement, ensuring that everyone felt safe and heard. Aaron's advocacy didn't stop with the police force. He also helped create programs that provided support for victims of police misconduct, offering them resources and a platform to share their stories. He wanted to make sure that no one felt as isolated as he did during his ordeal. Though the fight for justice was ongoing, Aaron began to see the impact of his efforts. More people were speaking out, more laws were being passed to hold law enforcement accountable, and more communities were taking steps toward healing. Aaron's journey had started with a single act of injustice, but it had grown into a powerful movement that brought people together. He also took time to reflect on his own journey. He realized that standing up for what was right had not only helped others, but had also helped him find his own strength. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and adversity, but in the end, he had helped spark a conversation that was long overdue. The path ahead was still filled with challenges, but Aaron was no longer fighting alone. With every step forward, he knew that he was helping to build a future where fairness, equality, and respect were not just ideals, but realities. As he looked back on the road he had traveled, Aaron felt a deep sense of pride. His actions had made a difference, and as long as he could, he would continue to push for change, knowing that even the smallest steps could lead to something bigger.